Hi everyone, and welcome to English Digest. I'm Pat.
And I'm Erin.
So we're on our writing unit for this month, and it's all about culture shock. Now, this is something that I'm sure both you and I have had since we've lived abroad, in your case, in several countries.
Well, I've lived abroad in 2 countries, but I've only really experienced culture shock in Taiwan, I guess. But going home is also a shock.
Yeah, you've had reverse culture shock. I've never been home for long enough to quite get that.
It is a real thing.
I understand.
Yeah. It's tough when you get used to a new place and then you kind of have a certain way of living and then you go back to the old way and it can be strange and confusing and things might not always make sense. So, yeah.
We get culture shock basically when we move to a different culture and live there. You wouldn't get it from a vacation. If you take a 2-week trip somewhere, you're not going to get culture shock unless it's somewhere radically different. But even then, you won't be experiencing the day-to-day things that generally make up culture shock.
Right. It would just sort of be everything that you experienced on a 2-week trip would just sort of be interesting and new and you might think it's funny or
strange,
like that.
Even if it annoys you. You're like, I'm only here on a vacation and then it's gone.
Yep.
If things bother you when you're living somewhere for a long time, you're going to have to find a way to deal with them or else move away.
Or just take part.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the culture shock I had in Taiwan was partly to do with the humidity, because I got here in May of 2008.
Yes.
And England is not at all humid, so I got here just as it was really starting to heat up. And I've never been anywhere this hot and humid. So that and the food. As a vegetarian, it took me a little bit of time to figure a few things out and a few sort of survival methods in terms of eating.
For me, it was the population size. That was the first thing that hit me because I'm from a very small town. I guess in Canada, it's considered a city. In world terms, it's considered a town. So a population of 70,000 maybe. And
which even for me, that seems pretty small.
Yeah. So, I mean, I first moved to Kaohsiung. So I went from, 70,000 was my hometown and my university town is maybe about 250,000. And then Kaohsiung is
couple of million,
3 million.
3 million.
Yeah.
All right. In a small space as well.
Right. And I arrived on the day that the plum rain started. So it was pretty tough.
Lovely. Okay.
Yeah.
So those are some examples of how culture shock. There are plenty more, and we'll mention a few more as we go on. But this writing unit is all about people's experience of culture shock. Before we actually get into details, as always, and we do say this every time, it is important to read the instructions for your writing exercise so you know what you have to do. Pay attention to the details, such as things like the number of words, number of paragraphs, what kind of content you need to write, and so on, because you can use that to structure your article. And if you don't do what the article instructions say, no matter how good your writing is, you will lose marks.
Because you always need to listen to the instructions.
Yeah.
Teachers need that to happen.
Yeah, otherwise they can't mark it well.
Exactly.
So here we have an article of around 120 words, and we're going to be using more than one paragraph. You might be wondering what goes in each paragraph. So when you're talking about an experience, here's a good sort of idea. The first one details the experience, where you were, what happened, how you felt, how it affected you, with some examples.
And the second paragraph can talk about how you dealt with these problems or overcame them, basically. So maybe they weren't so easy to overcome and you had to experience a lot of things to do it, and you can kind of give details about that. And even if you didn't manage to overcome it, you can talk about that as well. But the conclusion should be what you learned from the experience either way. Now, this is a story about you, of course. You're writing about your own personal experiences. So you'll be using first person to write it. And since it's an experience, you'll be writing mostly in the past tense with some present perfect as needed, or even past perfect to talk about things kind of further in the past.
Further in the past, sure. Now, when we talk about culture shock, there have been articles about this. You can find them pretty easily online. That it generally falls in 4 stages, some of which repeat. And we kind of call them the honeymoon stage or vacation stage, which is when everything's new, fascinating, the food is great. Then the kind of frustration stage where everything is more difficult. You're missing home, you're missing old friends.
Right.
That's the time when a lot of people will quit and go home.
Right. Little things make you really angry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. The third stage is about adjustment. You develop new routines, new habits. You come to accept a few things. You make changes that get over some other problems. And you start to kind of recover and follow on a new path.
Right.
Now, often those 2 stages, frustration and adjustment, will repeatedly cycle. You might live for a year and then you start to get frustrated with different stuff.
I mean, even
it comes back.
Even as far into my time in Taiwan as I am, I mean, well over a decade at this point, I still experience the frustration stage.
And sometimes they're different frustrations, and sometimes it's just, why aren't things like different or easier, something like that. And then you adjust again, and then when you get to the end, you acceptance.
Right. Basically just means you've accepted what it is and you kind of move on and go on with your day.
Yeah, I've heard of a sort of final stage which is called like mastery, which is basically when you've got so used to this new culture, it is your own culture. You're almost as close to a native of that country as you can be. You do everything the way the natives do. It's not easy to get to that stage. Some people will never get to that stage. Some people will leave that country before they do. So
you might, I mean, I would even say that I have mastered some things now. So I would say I'm maybe a half master.
Yeah. I mean, neither of us are particularly good at Chinese, so, we haven't mastered the language.
You're right. So I still get the frustration part sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you're a master, you're basically, you could have lived somewhere for 20 years. You're still not quite master of everything, and maybe you still do some things the way you did at home.
Right.
But that's how sort of culture shock passes. Most of what we're going to be doing here is the frustration and adjustment steps.
Exactly. All right.
So, essay time. Let's look at some brainstorming.
Okay, so this is a narrative essay, which means we're going to write in chronological order. So what that means basically is we're going to start at the very beginning with the earliest thing and move forward in time to the last thing that happened, which is what you sort of learned here. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a beginning, a middle, and an end. So we need to know the basic details before we can sort of form these. So what we're going to do is we're going to brainstorm, and we need to think about all the details we're going to write about to describe our experience. So we actually do this quite a bit. We ask our questions.
Especially with personal experiences.
Right. So who, what, where, when, why, and how. All right, so those are the most important question words we have in English. They basically build an outline for us, and we can use that outline to go on and write our essays. So what we're going to do, we're going to start out by asking and answering some of these questions based on the information we have in our writing samples.
Yeah, so we start off, who is the story about?
Me!
Yes, it's about you, so you're going to be writing in first person with I. That's easy.
Okay.
So where did this event happen?
In the UK.
Yeah, now we both chose the UK.
We did.
I mean, maybe I chose it because I'm from there and it would be a natural sort of, okay, I'll go for the UK. At least I can write. I know what would frustrate people about the UK.
Right. I don't have a reason for choosing it.
You just picked it.
I just picked it.
There we go.
Yeah.
So now we're going to have a why. Why were you in the UK on this long-term, culture shock experience?
Okay, well, we have 2 different writing samples, 2 different answers, but still sort of similar. One is a student camp. The other person is studying abroad. So, I mean, it could even be one and the same, but yeah.
I imagined it in mine as a sort of a 3-month-long summer sort of thing, which is long enough for you to experience some culture shock.
Right. I kind of considered mine as a year abroad.
Yeah, which would also make sense. Now, this is where we can get a lot more information. What was the problem? What kind of culture shock did you experience?
Okay, well, I think both of these kind of occur in both of our answers are kind of similar again. So language is always a big culture shock one. Loneliness is another. So
yes.
Those are really big things to come across when you go somewhere new.
And we could add more ideas to that.
Exactly.
You could be struggling with the food, the climate.
The population.
It could be very hot, very cold, very busy, suddenly very empty.
Right.
You could just be struggling with the differences in what people do every day.
Driving as well.
Yeah, that's true. In the UK, you'd be on the other side of the road.
Exactly.
And that's just not for drivers. If you're crossing the road, you'll have to start learning to look the other way first.
Right.
It could just be the fact that, bits of England are kind of dirtier or older. And as my wife found out on her visit to the UK, we're just not as connected. We don't have as good Wi-Fi networks. There's not as many free Wi-Fi networks.
That's a big problem in Canada as well, because it's so big, it's hard to kind of get it everywhere.
Yeah, so there we go. So there's lots of things that you could concentrate on there. Which one affects you? And now, how were you affected? How did this problem actually personally affect you?
All right, well, this is another one that can have a lot of different answers, just like the one before. In our articles, we chose to write about becoming self-conscious. You're sort of worried what other people are going to think of you. Maybe not having new friends is one that we talked about. Difficulties understanding your host family. If you're staying with a host family or, you're renting an apartment from a landlord, that can be really sort of a difficult situation to sort of navigate. And, some people stop being social because they're just worried about what will happen if they mess something up or they don't have any people to hang out with.
Going out and trying to interact just becomes too much pressure, so they just stay at home and talk with old friends or use the computer, and they don't really get out and experience the new country. We could also have other things like feeling miserable, coming home early. We could have, even actual mental sort of real problems that could come from these kind of experiences. So when we're answering these questions, we can just make short, simple answers, not even full sentences. Because we just need the ideas now. We'll work on making them into sentences later, but we're now going to look at the second paragraph, which, as we said earlier, is about kind of how you adjust and overcome these problems.
Right.
Or maybe you don't, and in that case, you can still write about that.
Exactly. Now, we're going to kind of use not as many as of our question words, but we're going to kind of ask them in a bit of a different way here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to find out sort of what you did to kind of get over the problem. So we say, how did things change?
So we could have something you did here. We talk about being more patient, not putting so much pressure on yourself. Or we could talk about something other people did. Host family speaking more slowly, classmate inviting you out to a social event, something, either a change you made or something that happened caused a change in your kind of bad situation. And then the next question would be, how did this start to change your life overall?
Yeah, we just sort of flipped a couple of words around in that question. First, we asked, how did things change? And then we say, how did this change things? So we could, again, have a lot of different answers. We could say, it's okay to make mistakes.
Sure.
Mistakes happen.
I tell that to all my students. Like,
Exactly.
don't worry about getting the grammar right. Just make people understand what you want. It doesn't matter if it's perfect.
Right. If you meet a new friend, they could help you confide in someone and actually get some of these feelings that you're having out, and they can sort of help you relax. They can introduce you to people.
Help
they
you
can
deal with stuff.
Yeah, they can make you just feel more comfortable.
Okay, and then sort of what did this lead to? What was the sort of final change after you'd made these adjustments? So improved English would be one thing if language is a problem.
Yep.
Talk about a better social life.
Right. You could even have language exchanges to do that improving your English. And you know what? Language exchanges also become friends. So that's going to help your social life too. And all of these things are going to help you become more confident. So you're less nervous about making mistakes or going out or those things.
Yeah, the final question we ask is going to lead to our conclusion, which is kind of how are you different now because of what happened? So sort of less about what happened when you were in the country, in the UK, having culture shock, but what is the sort of longer term gain from the experience?
Well, better English for one, or whatever other language that you happen to be learning, Spanish, French, and so on. And then you kind of can take that learning experience and apply some real value to it. You can kind of teach other future exchange students sort of what to expect. You can use it to kind of shape the way you answer interview questions at jobs, that sort of thing.
And you meet things in your day and go, remember when it was hard in the UK, I was more patient, I tried to relax, I didn't put too much pressure on myself. I can use that same plan here to help me deal with this problem.
Right.
So it's kind of learning from it. So this is how we've got loads of information, loads of details there about what happened, how you got over it, how are you different now. So we're going to take a short break now, and in a moment we'll look at how we can turn that into a more structured outline. Welcome back. So in that first part there, we asked a lot of simple questions and we gave a lot of simple answers. So you could just write one sentence for pretty much all of those questions.
Well, you could.
You could.
But, of course, this isn't going to make an essay. This is just Basically, what we've done is we've given ourselves the body. So we're going to use all that information to kind of put everything together. And that's just our body, so we still need an introduction and the conclusion. Now, we've got the information for it. We just need to kind of write it out. Now, we don't do this in one sentence for each thing because that does not make an essay. So let's look at the examples of introductions and conclusions from our magazine. So we have two different samples, and we have two different approaches to how we sort of started.
Slightly different in this case. So the first one is pretty simple. It's a nice, simple topic sentence. I had my first experience of culture shock last summer.
All right.
So we know the story is about you. We know what it's about. We know when it happened. So we've basically introduced the topic. More details can follow, but we've kind of really just given the basic topic, opening sentence there to get people right into, okay, this is what it's about. Now,
sample 2 sort of took a different approach from that. It says, before studying abroad in the UK last year, I'd never considered how much culture shock would affect me. So again, we know who, we know what we're talking about, we know where, and we know when it happened. Okay, so we've given a couple more details, and we did include a personal detail, how culture shock affected the person, and the fact that it was a surprise.
Yeah, so we already know there that this is probably a pretty bad experience because we say how much culture shock affected me, so that's kind of implying a lot, and that this was something that the person was not really ready for. So we've got some personal details already to lead us in. So those are our topic sentences, and we can then add some of our own details that we've brainstormed in part 1. So we'll use writing sample 1 to put these together. Again, the topic sentence, I had my first experience of culture shock last summer. Then we want some general ideas and details, just broad strokes here.
Let's find out why.
Yeah, I felt stressed out about having to use English all the time.
Okay,
so it's a language issue. It was hard to understand what my host family was saying, so it's going to make things difficult at home. I felt self-conscious about speaking English.
Which means you're not going to want to.
Yeah, and it's super necessary in England because English people are really bad at other languages. I know this for a fact. You kind of need to speak English to do class, to do home stuff, to do friend stuff, to buy things. Yeah, you're not really going to be able to get away without saying much at all.
Okay, well, then we move on to the second paragraph, and again, we start with a topic sentence. The topic sentence in this one also kind of short and concise. It says, I dealt with this problem by trying not to put too much pressure on myself. So just relax.
Yeah,
it's going to be okay.
Doesn't matter if you're not 100% perfect on your first try. And we kind of go into some details about this. I told myself to be patient and that I would improve. So that's kind of how you didn't put pressure on yourself. Then somebody else helps. My hosts helped me a lot by speaking more slowly. I mean, we don't mention it in the sample, but so maybe they just realized they were going too fast and changed changed. Maybe you just said to them, hey, could you speak a bit...
Slow down
a bit.
Yeah.
And it can be very hard in the UK because we have some crazy accents. Depending on where you go in the country, they could speak super slow. You wouldn't understand them. And then we get to that important point we made earlier. I realized no one cared too much when I made mistakes.
Exactly.
Sure, maybe your teacher will correct you, but if you're just chatting with friends, you don't need to be 100% perfect. You're not taking a test.
Yeah,
you're just trying to make yourself understood.
Of course. And you know what? If you do have those friends who are trying to help you, then if you make a mistake, you might say, oh, can you help me fix that? And they will.
Again, some more British personal experience. My country folks speak very bad English. So if you speak perfect English, they'll think you're amazing because you're better than them.
All right.
Okay, and our conclusion here is, while I had some difficult moments, I value the learning experience.
Okay.
So that's kind of concluding what we learned and how the person feels after the event.
All right. So obviously, with an outline, you're not putting all of your details in. You're keeping it short. You want just the basic ideas, building on the brainstorms that we had earlier. So when you're writing your essay, you're going to add more details, transitions, and more just to turn it into a full essay.
A few descriptive words.
Yeah. So what you just need to make sure now is that you follow a logical time structure. So remember, start at the very beginning and then move forward until the end. Don't leave out important details. You can cut some details out if they're not necessary, especially to stay in your word limit, but you need to include everything to make it make sense.
Yeah, if you're thinking you're writing too much, you can go back to your outline and check it and go, okay, these are important because they're in my outline, but some of this isn't. I'll remove that. Equally, you can go, well, hang on, this seems to have nothing at all to do with my essay. It's not in my outline. I'll cut it out. Or you could find a place where you go, oh, I should describe that more often. It's in my outline, so it's important to the essay. So let's have a look at how this is done by checking out the first writing sample. Writing Sample 1. I had my first experience of culture shock last summer. I was in the UK as part of a 2-month camp for students who wanted to major in English in college. However, after the first few days, I began to feel stressed out about having to use English all the time. For one thing, it was hard to understand everything my host family was saying. For another, I began to feel very self-conscious about speaking English. This stopped me from making new friends. I dealt with this problem by trying not to put too much pressure on myself. I just told myself to be patient and that I would slowly improve as long as I didn't give up. My hosts were very kind to me and helped me a lot by speaking more slowly. Moreover, I realized that no one I met cared too much when I made mistakes. This helped me relax, and my English improved as a result. While I had some difficult moments in the UK, I've come to really value the learning experience.
Okay, so we can kind of see how we put it together there. We have our initial topic sentences. Then we kind of explained a little bit more. We added where you were going, what you were doing there. Right.
Sure. A few more details about why you had problems and when they happened and what the host family was like and so on. So there's a few words in there we can take a quick look at to explain. We talked about majoring in English. Here we're using major as a verb to mean study a subject in college and that this is your primary subject. Major can also be used as a noun. Similarly, like biochemistry was my major, so it's my subject. It can also be used as a noun to describe yourself. You could say, I'm an English major. You can also minor in something or have a minor or even be a English minor. And that's your secondary subject.
Right.
I will note that in the UK, in my day, we didn't have, and I'm not sure even now if we do have, majors and minors. You sort of stick to one subject, but you can take maybe a few different classes that contribute to your overall grade, but you don't have majors majors and minors.
Right. And now if you do go to the US or Canada, you will have majors and minors. So
there we go. Different systems.
All right. So another phrase that we saw was to feel or to be stressed out. Now we know what stress is. That's when you're experiencing a lot of pressure to achieve something or succeed or do something. Now to be or feel stressed out just means to be under a lot of stress or pressure to the point where you're not quite functioning properly. Things are a lot harder. You might get upset more easily. You
make more mistakes.
Right.
You can't sleep too well sometimes. So one of the most important concepts in the first paragraph was being self-conscious. If you're self-conscious, you're maybe just too aware of your own actions, appearance, and abilities. Of course, you want to care about those things, but if you're maybe self-conscious, you're worrying too much about how you're perceived by others, and you're worrying about it to the point where you don't perform as well. You're just not really having fun with it because you're too worried about what other people think and how you appear.
All right, well, let's take a look at writing sample 2 to find out how the second writer approached this topic. Writing sample 2. Before studying abroad in the UK last year, I'd never considered how much culture shock would affect me. However, looking back on my time there now, I wish I'd spent more time preparing emotionally. Everything was new and exciting at first, but as time passed, I started feeling lonely. I hadn't made any friends to share my experiences with because I struggled with the language barrier. Discussing my feelings was difficult, and there were few people around who really understood. Unfortunately, my problems didn't improve right away. To avoid confusing and frustrating situations, I stopped going out. It was only when a classmate invited me to a movie that I really made a friend. We started hanging out, and soon I had someone to confide in. She helped me meet more people and even find a language exchange partner. I started enjoying my interactions with people more once I became more confident. That's why this year I'm helping future exchange students get ready for their journeys abroad.
Okay, so there are quite a few interesting words and concepts in part 2. We don't quite have time to explain them all, but I'm going to bring up the one language barrier. And this is when two or more people don't speak the same language, and this provides a barrier or an obstacle to communication and understanding. So if language barriers happen here between, me and local people, we don't quite understand each other all the time.
Yeah. All right, another interesting one is language exchange, something you might actually experience here in Taiwan. This is sort of just an arrangement in which two people who speak different languages help each other by teaching their respective languages. Right.
Yeah.
So, for example, in Taiwan, personally, I would have someone who speaks Chinese as my language partner, and I would help that person learn English.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly had that for a while. Did you ever have an actual language exchange?
I did informally. It wasn't like we meet every week, but it was more just with my first kind of co-teacher.
Okay.
She became a very good friend of mine, and she would teach me some things, and I would teach her some things.
That's cool. We also see the word exchange in exchange student, and this is a student from one country who studies in another, often because an arrangement between two schools or colleges when students from each one travel to study at the other. So maybe some kids from Taiwan study in a US school, some US kids come here to Taiwan to study in their school.
Right.
So again, the keyword exchange, something going both ways. All right, we are out of time for today. Thanks for listening, everyone, to our writing unit. Hope we've given you some helpful tips. For English Digest, I'm Pat.
And I'm Erin.
Talk to you again soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.